I used to go to this small bar a few nights a week after work. It wasn't a loud place, more of a quiet neighborhood bar with dim lighting, old wooden booths, and a jukebox that only played songs from the 70s and 80s. I liked it because I could sit at the far end of the bar, have a couple of drinks, and not be bothered. There was a man who came in almost every time I was there. He always sat in the same seat, the last stool on the left side of the bar, closest to the hallway that led to the bathrooms. He never talked to anyone. He would order one drink, usually a whiskey, and just sit there staring straight ahead. He wore the same dark coat every time, and his face always looked tired, like he hadn't slept properly in days. I never thought much of him at first. After a while, he just became part of the background. One Thursday night, I stayed a little later than usual. Most of the regulars had already left. The bartender was wiping down the counter and I was finishing my last drink. I glanced over and noticed the man was still there in his usual seat. The strange thing was, I hadn't seen him order anything in over an hour. His glass was empty and pushed slightly away from him. I looked down at my phone for a minute. When I looked back up, the seat was empty. I didn't see him get up or walk away. He was just gone. I figured he must have left while I wasn't paying attention. I finished my drink, paid my tab, and headed for the door. As I walked past the hallway that led to the bathrooms, I felt a cold draft. The bathroom lights were off, which was unusual. I don't know why, but I glanced down the hallway. At the very end, near the emergency exit, I saw the same man standing completely still, facing the wall. I stopped walking. He didn't move. He just stood there with his back to me. The emergency exit sign above him was flickering. I felt this strong urge to leave, so I did. I pushed through the front door and walked to my car a little faster than normal. The next week I went back to the bar. The man was in his usual seat again. Everything seemed normal, but later that night, when the place started to empty out, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The bartender walked past the man's empty glass, picked it up, and wiped the counter. But the man was still sitting there. The bartender acted like the seat was empty. I stared at him for a long time. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them. No expression, no recognition, just emptiness. I left and never went back to that bar again. A few months later, I ran into one of the old regulars at a different place. I carefully asked about the man who always sat at the end of the bar. The regular looked at me strangely and said, "What man? That seat's been empty for years. No one sits there." I never went near that street again after that night. I used to go to a place called the Red Lantern a few times a month. It was an old bar on the edge of town, the kind of place that still had sticky floors and a jukebox that only took quarters. The lighting was always dim, and the air smelled like old wood and cigarette smoke that never fully left, even after smoking was banned. I went there mostly because it was quiet during the week. I could sit at the bar, have 2 drinks, and leave without anyone trying to start a conversation. There was a waitress who worked the late shift. Her name was Marie. She was maybe in her mid-30s, always tired looking, but polite. She remembered regulars' orders. Mine was always the same. Whiskey, neat. One Wednesday night in November, I stayed later than usual. The place was almost empty. Just me, one other guy at the far end of the bar, and Marie. The other guy left around 11:40. Marie started wiping down the counters and stacking glasses. She asked if I wanted one more before last call. I said yes. While she poured the drink, she glanced at the front door and said something quiet, almost to herself. "He's late tonight." I asked who she meant. She just shook her head and smiled, like she had said too much. Then she went to the back to get more ice. A few minutes later, the front door opened. A man walked in. He was tall, thin, wearing a long dark coat that looked too heavy for the weather. He didn't look at anyone. He walked straight to the last stool on the left, the one closest to the hallway, and sat down without saying a word. Marie came back from the kitchen, saw him, and froze for half a second. Then she put on her normal face and asked what he wanted. He just held up 2 fingers. She poured him a drink and set it down without speaking. The man never touched it. He just sat there with both hands flat on the bar, staring at the mirror behind the bottles. I finished my drink and decided it was time to leave. When I stood up to put on my jacket, the man slowly turned his head and looked at me through the mirror. Our eyes met in the reflection. He didn't blink. I paid my tab and walked out. The cold air outside felt good after the heavy atmosphere inside. The next week I went back. Marie was there again. I asked her about the man from the previous Wednesday. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "What man?" I described him. Tall, long coat, sat at the end of the bar and never touched his drink. Marie's face changed. She leaned in a little and said very quietly, "No one sat there that night. That stool stays empty after 11. It has for years." I laughed it off at first, thinking she was messing with me. But the way she said it didn't feel like a joke. I never went back to the Red Lantern after that. A few months later, I heard the place closed down. Someone told me the new owners tore out the entire left side of the bar and rebuilt it. When I asked why, they just said the old section felt wrong. I still think about that night sometimes, the way the man looked at me through the mirror and never blinked, and how Marie acted like he had never been there at all.